Well, I'd like to welcome everybody here tonight. We're broadcasting from the little church on the hill in Wellsburg, Pennsylvania, under the auspices of the Elk Creek Historical Society. This is the home of our little Coffee House on the Hill program, which has been ongoing now for 30 years plus. And we'd also like to welcome you if you're listening in out there on one of the medias that this will be broadcasting on around the globe. We appreciate you joining us. And tonight we're going to talk about this fella right here, Fiddlin' John Carson from Georgia. And I'll start out here with a quote from a poem that was written by Stephen Vincent Benet, and it was called The Mountain Whippoorwill. And it said, "I'm hell broke loose in a new store shirt to fiddle all Georgia crazy." That was in reference to a fiddlers convention that occurred in 1927, and a fiddle contest actually. And one of the young up-and-comers by the name of Low Stokes beat old Fiddlin' John in this contest. And that was the inspiration behind this whole story, this poem. Fiddlin' John actually could have portrayed both characters in that at one part of his life or another. There was situations in his earlier life where he won contests similarly, and kind of displaced some of the old timers. So the significance of Fiddlin' John, this is the year now 2023. In 1923 he made a recording, and it kind of started a whole industry going. It was what most people accept as being the first commercially successful country music recording. They didn't call it country music back then, but they didn't really know that there was a market for that music yet. The old-time music, the earliest components of it in this country came over from the British Isles, the British and Irish folkways. It's very old, some of it hundreds of years old. And it settled, a lot of it, in the remote areas in our Appalachian Mountains. And it just kind of, because of the remoteness of it, it survived there in a very pure form. It was affected over the years. There was minstrel shows that would travel through the countryside. Some of the minstrel tunes wound up being kind of assimilated into the local cultures. And in the early 20th century, there was song catchers that were traveling down through the mountains and finding and documenting these old songs. And sometimes they couldn't tell an original old, hundreds of year old British song from something that was written, say, in the 1840s. The African influence on our music was profound, even with the old-time fiddling. If you kind of pay attention, that old-time fiddling in this country doesn't sound the same as Irish fiddling. It changed, and that's one of the major reasons why, is because of the African influence and the different rhythms and sensibilities that they brought to it, playing European instruments and so forth. So Fiddlin' John was born, most accounts say he was born on the 3rd of March in 1868 in Fannin County, Georgia. There was, back in those days, they didn't keep records well at all down there. There was really no, and his birth date and place of birth has actually showed up as various times and places. For whatever reason, nobody really knows. It's just kind of mysterious. But that's kind of the accepted story anyhow. And you know what, let's take a look at our next image here. There's a image of him probably from a newspaper of the time, fiddling champ of the Southland, which I think he won championships about 11 times, to the point where in some areas they just said, you know, just please don't enter the contest, because a lot of it was a popularity contest. He was a very popular character. Sometimes it was questionable how great of a fiddler he really was. But actually there was a story about that, which his grandson, John R. Carson, later recalled that John's grandson, he said he would walk up to a man and get a hold of him, and when he walked away, that man was his friend. Peanut Brown, who knew John for years and played with him, recorded with him in the 1930s, said he'd stand there and pick on that fiddle and stutter and crack jokes so that nobody cared whether he played the thing or not. John just sort of had people mesmerized. So apparently he had a very engaging personality. So I guess before we go any further, let's move on to our video. Let's go down and visit Fannin County. All right, we're rolling once again. So we're doing our story on Fiddlin' John Carson. And today we are in his hometown of Blue Ridge, Georgia, in Fannin County. And this was the often accepted ancestral home of Fiddlin' John Carson. Some of his 19th century life is not that well documented. They didn't even really have birth certificates at that time, so his birth date sometimes is a little you know, documented in different ways and whatnot, but this was the town that he generally you know, advertised himself as being from, and it's definitely up in the Blue Ridge Mountains. We're in North Georgia. Can't really show you the scenery because we're really kind of on top of the mountains here, but I can attest from having driven up here today that the North Georgia mountains in the spring are absolutely gorgeous. The trees in bloom and leaves coming out and so forth, and hardwoods and pine woods and so forth. It's a very, very beautiful part of the country. So Fiddlin' John spent his early years up in this area and not only learned his fiddling, but did some railroad work and farming and things of that nature. And so it was in later years, in the early 20th century, that he wound up moving down into the Atlanta area, in the area they called Cabbagetown. And there was a large contingent of country people that had moved down there to work in the textile industry and the cotton mills and so forth. And so they lived in town, but they still liked their fiddling and their dancing and their country ways. And that was the environment which he became popular when he played on the WSB radio, and starting in 1922, and then later made the first record in 1923. And but he was already widely popular. He was very well known across Georgia even before that. So this was my attempt to, you know, cover some of his territory and to you know, occupy some of the space that he occupied in his lifetime. And I probably won't make it down into Atlanta proper, but yesterday I was over in Gordon County and Calhoun at the Gordon County Fiddlers Convention, and now today up in Blue Ridge. And so we're going to give you maybe an old Fiddlin' John tune here or two while we're here. We have a little competition from a little bit of traffic, and we have a couple roosters having a crowing contest here, but we'll see if we can battle them. So we'll give you one of Fiddlin' John's tunes that was popular in the early Grange movement. It's called "The Farmer is the Man." When the
farmer comes to town with his wagon broken down. The farmer is the man that feeds them all. And the lawyer, I declare, will tell a lie, I swear, but the farmer is the man that feeds them all. Well, the farmer's black and dirty, and he works like a turkey, got the good clothes hanging in the hall. If you only look and see, I know you will agree that the farmer is the man that feeds them all. Well, the doctor hangs around while the blacksmith whoops his iron, but the farmer is the man that feeds them all. And the preacher and the cook go strolling on the brook, but the farmer is the man that feeds them all. If you only look and see, I know you will agree that the farmer is the man that feeds them all.
So there you have it, the report from North Georgia. So Fiddlin' John's early years in the 19th century are not really that well documented. And the people in that time and place had a tendency to kind of be fond of tall tale telling. And maybe they call it marketing nowadays, I don't know. But a lot of the stories, maybe some of them propagated by Fiddlin' John himself, were, just made it kind of hard to really realize what was true and what was half-truth or whatever. But it's generally known he did some little farming work, some railroad work. Some accounts say they even rode horses at one time, possibly as a jockey. And of course, one of the main occupations up there in the mountains made a little moonshine. And he kind of made a big deal out of that. That became kind of his persona in later years, was kind of this cantankerous old mountaineer that made moonshine. And they made a lot of, mileage out of that. So he, in that day and age, it was before any mass media of any sort. The local communities had to make and provide all their own entertainment. So the fiddle and the dance was the big thing. He definitely would play at dances. He learned to call the dance while playing. And that's how people, entertained themselves and blew off steam back in them days. The community would get together, maybe in somebody's house, roll the carpet back, and everybody gang in there and dance the old squares, play the fiddle, call the dance. Another thing that he got involved in back in those days, by some accounts, is playing for political campaigns. Back in those days, the vast majority of the people across the United States, for that matter, but across Georgia itself, lived on farms, and the farm vote was a big deal. That was a big part of it. And so the politicians would have to, go out and into the country and make stump speeches, and they would always have this, cadre of these old fiddlers along to get everybody all worked up and everything, and draw a crowd and whatnot. And there was actually one interesting account. It was printed in a newspaper. Now, whether that means it was true or not, but this is an example of the type of stories that circulated about. I'll share this with you. It was printed March 23rd, 1879. A political speaking was held at Copper Hill, Tennessee, and among the mountaineers who crossed the nearby Georgia line for the occasion was a timid, tattered lad of 11. In a homespun pillowcase under his arm, the boy carried a venerable fiddle, which his grandfather had given him on his birthday exactly 1 year before. Nearly 100 years before that, grandfather Alan Carson had brought the instrument from Ireland to Fannin County, Georgia, in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where John was born. As the day wore on, the mountaineers wearied of the ranting politicians, and somebody asked the boy with the fiddle to play a tune. He complied, and as his bow began to dance across the strings of his instrument, the crowd turned from the platform and surged toward him. In 5 minutes, the speaking was broken up. "What's your name, son?" asked a big, handsome man in a broad-brimmed hat who came pushing his way through the crowd about the young musician. "John Carson," answered the boy. "From now on, it's Fiddlin John Carson," said the stranger, and that's how Fiddlin John Carson got his name. The big man in the big hat had been speaking from the platform when the fiddle began to sing, but he seemed to mind not at all that the mountaineer boy had stolen his audience. He admired John's instrument, which was a Stradivarius reproduction dated 1714, and asked the musician to play his favorite tune, "The Little Old Log Cabin in the Lane." When the selection was finished, he led John away and bought him his first suit of store clothes he had ever worn. The stranger was Fiddlin Bob Taylor, later governor of Tennessee. So that was basically the life of, in the 19th century. Right around 1900, he got married a gal by the name of Jenny Scroggins, and they eventually had 8 children, and they moved to Atlanta right around 1900. And most of the family worked at the Exposition Mill and also the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill. It was 2 big textile mills that was in that area. They called them wool hats. That was kind of the slang term for the country people that they considered themselves still country people, even though they were kind of living in town. So they worked in these textile mills. The population of Atlanta grew by 7-fold between the Civil War and 1900, so it was a very burgeoning, growing area. One of the main streets back at that town that went through this area that they called Cabbage Town was Decatur Street. And it was kind of a big, broad section of people that inhabited that, but Fiddlin John would routinely walk up and down that street and play on the street for tips and so forth. So he started to become well known in the area. In 1913, they started holding large fiddler conventions in Atlanta. 1913 was the first one. And these went on up into the Depression. In the 1930s, they finally kind of fell by the wayside. So he became very much, more and more popular through this. A lot more people got to know who he was. And it was about this time where he got the idea of starting, and the automobile was starting to come into the picture, so they became more mobile. And he kind of came up with this idea of traveling out into the countryside and putting on shows in small towns and selling song sheets and so forth, and mostly just playing for tips is basically what it amounted to. Later they kind of got the idea of kind of doing a free show like at the courthouse steps or in the town square during the day, and then advertising a paid performance later in the evening. So there was other people from the area that was kind of doing this same type of thing, and a fellow by the name of Gid Tanner, who became very famous later with his band called the Skillet Lickers. He was another person. If there was anybody else that was very similar to Carson as far as he was a very popular character, maybe not the greatest fiddler in the world, pretty decent, but that was arguable. There were other fiddle players around that were more technical, but they didn't have the personality. They weren't band leaders. So that leads us up to basically where things really start to heat up. When you start to approach the late teens up into the 1920s, that was an era that was maybe similar to what some of us have seen in our lifetime, with the rise of the internet and the different technologies that we've seen come into common use relatively quickly. So you had the automobile. There was 4,000 registered automobiles at the turn of the 20th century. And by 1930, there was almost somewhere around 27 million. The first commercial radio broadcast was KDKA out of Pittsburgh in 1920. And that took off like crazy. Radio became very popular. A lot of the radio stations back in those days were the particular entity that owned them. For instance, WLS out of Chicago was owned by Sears and Roebuck, and WLS stood for World's Largest Store. So the first big station that opened in the South was WSB in Atlanta. Welcome South, brother. That was what that stood for. And it hadn't been on the air very long when old Fiddlin John decided that he wanted to take a crack at it. He walked up into the offices and kind of said, you know, would you mind if I play a few tunes over the radio? And they said, yeah, I guess that would be okay. March 16th, 1922 was actually the date on that. So he started playing, and of course in those days they didn't have any type of programming. It was a brand new, you know, you might hear a classical pianist or an opera singer or an old-time fiddler. You know, it was all just kind of trial and error. And so he played some tunes, and the phone lines just literally lit up. People were calling in from all over. You know, actually, back in those days, some of those stations had, you know, there was very little interference, and they covered many, many states, and there was people calling in from half the continent, requesting tunes and so forth. So they found out it was very popular. And Carson actually said later that radio made me. He said that's what really blew the lid off of it, because he said then he had requests to just travel and play all over the place, and it was you know, more than he could even kind of keep up with, you know. So toured a lot during the 1920s. He had a kind of a group of characters, kind of a rotating group of people that would travel with him. So I think before I go much farther, I'm going to maybe play a couple tunes of Carson's. I'll start off with one that was, the Boll Weevil was apparently a big problem down there. It showed up in Georgia right around in the 1920s, and it was a pest that had come up across through Texas, and it was kind of moving its way east, and it was very devastating to the crops and so forth. It caused a big problem. They eventually eradicated it, I guess, in the 1980s, but anyhow, the Boll Weevil would destroy the cotton crops, and figured pretty heavily in the local, you know, tunes and so forth down there. So this one's called The Honest Farmer. I saw an honest farmer, his back was bending low, picking out his cotton, he couldn't hardly go. He piled it up in a rail pen till the merchant come, and they might catch him at his cotton, that he might pay them some. And it's goodbye, Boll Weevil, for you know you ruined my home. You know you've got my cotton, and the merchant's got my corn. I saw him in the summer, it was hot as it could be, strolling through the harvest field, the sweat was running free. He swung his cradle round him and gripped the golden grain, drew forth his handkerchief and wiped the sweat again. And it's goodbye, Boll Weevil, for you know you ruined my home. You know you've got my cotton, and the merchant's got my corn. His footsteps, they grew weaker as he walked up the hill to his little cabin and sat upon the sill. His wife, she kneeled beside him, her hair all turned gray. Trust now in the Savior, we'll find a home someday. And it's goodbye, Boll, Weevil, for you know you ruined my home. You know you've got my cotton, and the merchant's got my corn. We're going to check the tune on this just a little bit here. The vagaries of the weather and the old wooden instruments. All right. Well, I'll give you another one here. It's a kind of a more of a little comical ditty, I guess, which was a big part of their, you know, humorous stuff and so forth. But this one is called Papa's Billy Goat. Papa bought him a great big billy goat. Ma, she washed most every day. Hung the clothes out on the line. That darned old goat, he come that way. He pulled down the red flannel shirt and it just ought to hear the buttons crack. I'll get even with the son of a gun. I'm gonna tie him across the railroad track. Tied him across the railroad track and the train was a-coming with a powerful rate. He belched up that old red shirt and then he flagged down the darned old freight. Went to the depot and I bought me a ticket and I walked right in and I sat down, hung the ticket in the brim of my hat and the doggone wind blowed it out on the ground. Conductor come around and said, where's your ticket? And I had to pay again to be left on the tracks. I'll get even with a son of a gun. I bought a round trip ticket and I ain't a-coming back. Well, I acted an old fool and married me a widow, and the widow had a daughter by the name of Maud. Father being a widower, burying a daughter, and now my daddy is my own son-in-law. Let a little roll later on the board, tune up the fiddle, give it sugar in the gourd, and I can't get it out. On the way to get sugar, I don't know what about. Had a little head, had a wooden leg, best darn head that ever laid day, laid more eggs than he had around a barn, and another little drink wouldn't do me any harm, turkey and straw. Thank you. Well, another development along about this time was the phonograph, which had actually been developed initially back in the 1880s by Thomas Edison. He kind of intended it to be mostly for speech, and recording, speeches and documenting famous orators and that type of thing. Right around the early 1900s, they developed the idea of recording popular music so they could sell, more phonographs. And companies like Victor, they recorded Caruso, the famous tenor, the John Philip Sousa's marching band, things of that nature. And so it was right along about 1920 when a relatively small company, the General Phonograph Company, and they had the record label, OK Records. I don't know if there's old Fiddlin John. That was one of the song folios they had rigged up to sell his tunes and so forth. There's the OK record label. Back up one more. We got a picture of Fiddlin John with Gid Tanner that I was talking about. There's old Gid on the right there. So the OK record label was the label of the General Phonograph Company. And this fellow by the name of Ralph Peer worked for this company. And he made a recording in 1920 of a gal by the name of Mamie Smith, and it started the blues craze, and that became very popular. So the OK Company had actually kind of found their niche with folk music, but it was a different kind of folk music. It was stuff that catered to the different ethnic groups. There was different type of Lithuanian and Polish and all this different folk music of that nature. They kind of offered that for sale to the public. So they were kind of a smaller market type of thing. So they found that there was a market for this blues stuff. And about the same time, one of their engineers developed portable equipment. They had a kind of a weighted and almost like a cuckoo clock and a governor mechanism that controlled the speed of it so it could cut at a very steady speed. And they developed this to where they could take it and set it up in remote locations. Initially, the equipment was very large and cumbersome, and it was only the specific studios that they could do this. So they went on a trip down to the Atlanta area to record blues people and so forth. That was the initial intent. And there's, again, a couple different accounts of how this came to be. A lot of times back in those days, the furniture dealer in town wound up selling records because the old Victrolas and the phonographs kind of looked like a piece of furniture. So it was just a natural fit. They sold the records and they sold the phonographs. So there was a fellow from Atlanta by the name of Polk Brockman, and he was the local furniture dealer, and he'd been kind of acting as an agent for the OK Company and lining up the talent and so forth for these recording sessions. And some folks say that he had it in mind to record Fiddlin John. Other people kind of say that it was almost kind of by accident. There was a couple of people that didn't show up, and it was kind of just a last minute thing to fill in and take up some time. But however it occurred, well, they decided to record Fiddlin John. He had at this time, a large local following, and so on the 14th of June in 1923, he went into the studio that they had set up there in Atlanta, which actually they just tore the building down a few years ago. It was on Nassau Street. And I think there's very little in Atlanta. Atlanta has continued to just grow like crazy, and there's probably very little there now that would be recognizable to anybody from Fiddlin John's era. But that building, there's actually going to be a giant Margaritaville hotel there in its place. So they say they are going to put a plaque out on the street that this is where it happened. So anyhow, it's wonderful. So anyhow, he went on in there and he cut a record, The Little Old Log Cabin in the Lane, which was an old minstrel tune, old popular tune, had been around for decades at that point. And I think the flip side of it was called The Old Hen Cackled and the Rooster's Gonna Crow. That was just an instrumental piece. So when Mr. Peer who was kind of a northern urbanite, and he, it was really kind of an odd mix that he would be involved with these hillbillies. He really didn't, I don't think, appreciated the aesthetics of it that much, but whether it was the material or the quality of the recording, he said, well, this is just awful and we can't issue this. So he refused to put a label number on it, refused to put it in the OK catalog. So Polk Brockman, he said, I'll tell you what, I'll pay you up front for 500 copies. And he said, you send them down here, I'll pay you for them. So they showed up, and it was about 2 weeks before there was one of these big fiddlers conventions, and they set a phonograph up on the stage, and Fiddlin' John played his record, and then he played the tune live, and within 15 minutes they sold all 500 of them over the footlace. So when Mr. Peer heard about that, his business sense said, well, we need to get old Fiddlin' John up to New York here and make some more records. And so that, basically started the whole ball rolling. And it wasn't long before there was other companies, that were going out and searching for this type of talent and so forth. And there's much more to the story. Fiddlin' John was just the beginning of it. So Mr. Peer was an interesting guy. Ralph Sylvester Peer, born in 1892. His father owned a store where they sold different types of appliances, phonographs being one of them, sewing machines, and they sold Columbia records and phonographs. And he wound up kind of learning the business, even as a teen, to the point where when he was in his early 20s, he worked as like a district representative for Columbia, and became very well versed in the whole business and everything. And then it was from there he went over to this OK company, and eventually started the field recordings and whatnot. Later on in his career, he would switch over to the Victor Company, which was the biggest phonograph company out there. And so he was an interesting person and very important in the scheme of this whole thing. Not only just the country music business, but he went on to discover a lot of talent in the pop music field. Louis Armstrong, for instance, Fats Waller, people like that. But it was the idea of the way the early efforts at this worked is a guy would show up with a song, and he'd make a record, and they would pay him a flat fee. They'd pay him $25 or something, and off he'd go. They'd never hear from him again. And that's kind of the way it worked. So Peer got the idea that he realized that this was going to take repeat business, to keep building this catalog. And so he needed to find people that could not only write songs that sounded like the old familiar tunes, but they also wanted people that could bring them old songs that were, almost like old public domain, some of these hundreds of years old songs that they could put over as being new and copyright them. And so he insisted on paying a royalty, making a contract and paying a royalty to these people for the sales so that they would continue to bring more songs. And so this started, his whole philosophy, which he kind of discovered on the fly as they proceeded along, basically formulated the basis of what we've have known as the recording industry for the past 100 years. The idea of all these copyrights and royalty payments and all of that stuff was really, Ralph Peer was a big, huge part of that. And so what happened was these people, Fiddlin' John and some of his cohorts from this era, were almost like the first folk revivalists, because the reason this music was so popular at the time with a lot of people is that this was an age, which to us now looking back seems quaint, you know, the Model T Fords and stuff like that. It seems like a kind of a quaint era. But to the people that grew up in the 19th century at that time, you know, the automobile age, the jazz age, you know, the Volstead Act went into force in 1920, and it created this whole bootleg booze industry and everything. And a lot of people just felt like the world was going crazy, and they had a thirst for this going back to the old familiar traditional tunes. So in a way, these people in this, we tend to think of a folk revival, some of us remember from back in the 1950s and 60s, but this was almost like the same thing. These people were kind of revivalists in their own way, kind of in this time. Mr. Peer went on with the Victor Company 4 years after the Carson episode here, did a recording session in Bristol, Tennessee, and that's what they refer to as the Big Bang of country music, because he discovered Jimmy Rogers and the Carter family and recorded them both for the first time in 1927. And that really set the industry. It was like the end of the pioneering age, and it was the beginning of what would later become the industry. So Fiddlin John, he had his cohorts that he worked with. The person that became kind of instrumental in his music was his youngest daughter, Rosalie Carson. And she became known by the moniker Moonshine Kate. And they would actually, another thing that became popular at this time was what they called, at the time they called them talking records, but it was comic dialogue, and now we call them skit recordings. And Carson did several of these. Gid Tanner and the Skillet Lickers actually had a whole running series of them. It was called A Corn Liquor Still in Georgia. And a lot of it was, some of it was fairly amusing and fairly clever. It was probably somewhat corny by, you know, maybe even the standards of the time, and certainly by today's standards. But they were very popular in their time. And so Fiddlin John, you know, kind of portrayed this old moonshiner type of character, and Moonshine Kate was kind of the sharp-tongued hillbilly daughter, you know, and that was the core of it. But she'd been actually playing on the street with him since she was like 3 years old. She did the old buck and wing dance, and they'd go out and you know, busk on the street, and she'd dance and so forth. So she made a comment one time, which I thought was kind of funny, as they kind of proceeded, you know, into the Depression era in the 1930s. Well, things kind of slowed down. Carson did make a final set of recordings for the Bluebird label, which was Victor's cheaper label, but things slowed down in general. But at one point in their career, just to give you an idea of how far they ranged, she talked about having played in Quebec and in Havana, Cuba, and in Mexico. And she rated them kind of in that order. She said Quebec was pretty good. Havana, they didn't know us from a sack of salt, but spoke English. Mexico, she said they didn't know what was going on. Finally, they got out and tried to shake a leg a little bit, but it didn't look like any kind of dancing I ever saw. I thought that was kind of comical. So anyhow, that was from Moonshine Kate. I'm going to try a couple more here. This is one that I'm not sure where this came from. One thing that's interesting about Fiddlin John is that he would do a song that was written actually in the 20th century, and it sounded ancient. So it talked a lot about, you know, it displayed a lot about the folk process of how a song can be assimilated and so forth. But this was one he recorded, and it was the first, this was, I think the theme of it has been done over and over through the years, the idea of the train whistle blowing, you know, 100 miles or 500 miles or whatever the distance would happen to be. This was supposed to be the first recorded version of what was the Reuben complex, the Reuben's train complex. It goes something like this. I'll pawn you my watch I'll pawn you my chain, pawn you my gold diamond ring. If that won't pay my little woman's fine, I'll pawn you my wagon and my team. You can count the days I'm gone on that train that I left on. You can hear the whistle blow 100 miles. If this train runs right, I'll see more tomorrow night. Lord, I'm 900 miles away from home. I used to have a woman, she would walk and talk with me. Now she's a settin' on some other rounder's knee. She done told him what she won't tell me. Lord, I hate to hear that lonesome whistle blow. You can count the days I'm gone on that train that I left on. You can hear the whistle blow 100 miles. If this train runs right, I'll see more tomorrow night. Lord, I'm 900 miles away from home. I went down to the depot not many days ago. Got on the train and the train went a-flying. I looked back behind, saw my baby was a-crying. Said he's gone and left me alone. You can count the days I'm gone on that train that I left on. You can hear the whistle blow 100 miles. If this train runs right, she'll see John tomorrow night. Lord, I'm 900 miles away from home. Thank you. Well, we'll do you another Boll Weevil song. The farmer said to the Boll Weevil, I believe you're on the square. The Boll Weevil said to the farmer, my whole darn family's there. Come to get your home, come to get your home. The Boll Weevil said to the doctor, you can put out your little pill, but when I get through with the farmer, can't pay no doctor bill. Come to get his home, come to get his home. The Boll Weevil said to the farmer, I'm gonna swing right on your gate, and when I get through with your cotton, you're gonna sell that Cadillac. Ain't gonna get your home, gonna get your home. The farmer said to the merchant, I want some meat and meal. Go away from here, you son of a gun. You got Boll Weevils in your field. Gonna get his home, they come to get your home. The Boll Weevil said to the farmer, you could ride in that Ford machine, but when I get through with your cotton, you can't buy no gasoline. You're gonna get your home, come to get your home. Well, one thing that I should mention, I guess, thank you, by the way, about music from that era, it's a little hard to listen to in a way. Some of his stuff was better than others, you know, recording quality-wise and content-wise, I guess, or the execution of it. But something, you know, to mention the word presentism is used a lot, you know. Some of it, you know, you have to realize it was, like any study of American music and the history of it, you're going to run into stuff that was, you know, it was a different era. There was terminologies and stuff that weren't, you know, what would be considered politically correct nowadays. And it was all over the place back in those days. It's just what it was. There's a lot of people that have discussed this, you know, that really, you know, you have to kind of, you know, meet it head on, and some of it was difficult, but it was the crucible in which, you know, all of our great music was formed, and it's kind of what enabled it. So in the 1930s, going back to the political situation, Fiddlin and John wound up stumping for the governor's race at the time, and kind of as a consequence of that, he wound up getting a job in the state capitol running the elevator. And so he kind of had friends in high places, as you would say. For a wool hat, you know, not a bad gig. One thing I thought was kind of comical is he would call out the floors as they go up, kind of like a train conductor would call the stations. And the floor where the governor's office was Sugar Creek, because that was where Governor Talmadge was from, Sugar Creek. The gas chamber, that was where the main floor of the House and the Senate was, and that's pretty self-explanatory. And the top floor of the Capitol, they had the Department of Wildlife and so forth had flora and fauna up there, so we would call that the Garden of Eden. Just, you know, a little bit about his you know, humor and so forth. Well, after the 1930s, you know, the Depression kind of really squelched, you know, everything, and record sales just went through the floor, and pretty much everything did. After, you know, the Depression, the Second World War, nothing was ever really the same. You know, there was massive population shifts, the whole demographics changed, there was different tastes, electric instruments came in. So, you know, by the time you got into the 1940s and 50s, this pioneering era was already long forgotten. It was just, it was kind of a very special little period in time where they captured this really pure folk music, and there was really nothing else like it again. Fiddlin and John, in his later years, he would occasionally go out and play a little gig here and there. There was a car line, a streetcar line that came past his house, and sometimes he'd sit out on the porch and they'd actually stop and people would listen to him play a few tunes. You know, it was kind of like listening to the last whistle of a famous old train or something like that, you know. Sometimes he'd even jump on the car and ride out, you know, to the end of the line and back and entertain and so forth. He's not in the Country Music Hall of Fame, which is almost kind of typical. There's a lot of these pioneers that are not, and, you know, people that have made great contributions in later years. So I'm going to finish up here, or get close to finishing up, and we'll do you a couple more tunes. This is for anybody that's interested in fiddle tunings. This one's in G. It's what they call a sawmill tuning. It's an open tuning, which Fiddlin and John used a lot. I think he did use standard tuning and the old D-dad, low D tuning he used on occasion, and the C-sharp one for the drunken hiccups. He recorded about 121 songs altogether. Another guy that you could compare him to that was a very similar character was Uncle Dave Macon. It was the first big star of the Grand Ole Opry. He actually became better known in country music or old-time music circles because he was with the WSM Grand Ole Opry, which even ongoing to this day still exists. And he made it onto the Harry Smith Folk Anthology in 1952, and Fiddlin' John did not. WSB in Atlanta, they just kind of seemingly kind of abandoned, you know, the whole country music industry just kind of passed them by and just moved on, and they just weren't much involved with it anymore. Another thing that was kind of popular in those days was topical songs, and this kind of gives you an idea of some of the commentary that they would come up with. Do we have more images on here? Let's roll through a few more of them and see if there's Mr. Peer. Now, did we see, we didn't look at Mr. Peer, did we? That was Ralph Peer, very suave looking fellow. He actually raised camellias, that was like his hobby, and won awards with that and everything, so he had somewhat highbrow taste. What else we got there, Maestro? There's, yeah, you're blasting through at a breakneck pace. There's Fiddlin' John with Moonshine Cake. They're traveling. They got a Model A Ford there that they're traveling in, so that was a little bit later years. They're still on the road. Had exclusive record artists up there. And there's another picture of them on stage somewhere. I think that's it. Give you a couple more tunes here. This one's called There's a Hard Time A-Comin'. Old man wants to marry and he would if he could if he would. Go all around in an old sack coat, and the hair on his face looks like a billy goat. Leave it to my soul, there's a hard time a-comin'. Yes, oh Lord, there's a hard time a-comin'. Well, the dirty old blacksmith puffin' he'll blow, make you a plow and also a hoe. Says he'll make it for half the amount, and when he's done, he'll double the account. Leave it to my soul, there's a hard time a-comin'. Yes, oh Lord, there's a hard time a-comin'. Well, the preacher in the pulpit, preaching mighty bold, preaching for the dollar and not for the soul. Right on the circuit, 12 times a year, you can die and go to, but the preacher don't care. Leave it to my soul, there's a hard time a-comin'. Yes, oh Lord, there's a hard time a-comin'. Well, the dang old doctor I like to forgot, I believe to my soul he's the worst in the lot. Says he'll cure you for half you possess, and when you're dead and gone, he'll sue you for the rest. Leave it to my soul, there's a hard time a-comin'. Yes, oh Lord, there's a hard time a-comin'. Thank you. Well, I'm going to do you now the tune that, as they say, started it all. This was the one that was recorded, the first one in 1923. And as I said, it was an old tune even then, and it was called The Little Old Log Cabin in the Lane. Now I'm getting old and feeble, and I cannot work no more. My rusty bladed hoe I've laid to rest. Our father and dear mother, they are sleeping side by side. Their spirits folks they have gone. You'll never hear them singing in the cane. And the only friend I got here is that little dog of mine in my little old log cabin in the lane. Well, the chimney's falling down and the roof's all caved in. Let's in the sunshine and the rain, while the angels watching over me as I lay down to sleep in my little old log cabin in the lane. Now the footpath is grown up that led us round the hill. The fence has all gone to decay, and the pond is done dried up where we once did go to mill. Things have turned its course another way. I ain't got long to stay here, what little time I got. I'll try and rest contented while I remain, till the angels call this dog and me to find a better home than a little old log cabin in the lane. Well, the chimney's falling down and the roof's all caved in. Let's in the sunshine and the rain, while the angels watching over me as I lay down to sleep in my little old log cabin in the lane. Thank you, thank you. Well, December the 11th, 1949, friend and columnist Ernest Rogers wrote of John's passing. Those of us who knew and loved Fiddlin John Carson in those days, when he was bringing a fresh, clear note to the ears of the nation, mourns his passing, yet we commit him to eternity with the recollection that he gave to humanity his dearest possession, the beloved songs of his boyhood that always sang in his heart. Bear me away on your snowy white wings to my immortal home. Bear me away on your snowy white wings to nevermore to roam. Thank you. Well, I want to thank everybody here tonight. I really appreciate you coming out and listening to me, and I hope you enjoyed it. And anybody that's out there across the world that's listening in, I appreciate you. I'm glad you tuned in, and I hope you enjoyed it. Had a little fun, picked up a couple of pointers here and there. And so I'd like to acknowledge here the venue, the folks at the Elk Creek Historical Society. We appreciate you. We thank you for the wonderful old facility here, built in 1855. Ashley, we appreciate you especially coming out tonight. And our tech people here, we got Mr. James Houlihan Jr. over there that was running the slideshow. And a little quick on shifting the gears there, but it all works good. And Mr. Jonathan Mingoy, the tech, we're doing our recording here and our sound and everything. We appreciate you. And so that's it. There's more to the story. Maybe we'll do this again sometime, and we'll talk about what came down the pike after old Fiddlin John. So good night, good day. Thank you kindly.